Traditions and Encounters, A Brief Global History by McGraw Hill. Chapter 3, Part 1. Eyewitness, Warrior Gods and Sage Kings, Heroes in South and East Asia. For a god, Indra was a very rambunctious fellow. According to the stories told about him, the Aryans, Sanskrit for noble ones, Indra had few, if any, peers in fighting, feasting, or drinking. The Aryans were a nomadic and herding people who spoke an Indo-European language and who migrated to South Asia over a prolonged period after about 15,000 CE. In the early days of their migrations, they took Indra as their chief deity. The Aryans told dozens of stories about Indra and sang hundreds of hymns in his honor. One favorite story described how Indra brought rain to the earth by killing a dragon who lived in the sky and hoarded water in the clouds. When the dragon fell to earth, its weight caused such turmoil in the atmosphere that it rained enough to fill 7 rivers in northern India. Those rivers in turn brought life-giving waters to the inhabitants of the region. A warrior such as Indra was a useful god for the Aryans, because as they migrated into South Asia, they fought among themselves and may have come into conflict with indigenous peoples already living there for thousands of years and more. Aryans looked on the rowdy raucous war god as a ready source of inspiration as they sought to build a society in an already occupied land. In ancient China, heroic figures were quite different. Legends tell stories of heroes who invented agriculture, domesticated animals, taught people to marry and live in families, created music, introduced the calendar, and instructed people in the arts and crafts. Most dashing of those heroes were sage king named Yu, who helped lay the foundations of Chinese society. By rescuing China from the devastating floodwaters of the Yellow River, rather than dam the river as his predecessors had done, Yu dredged it and dug canals parallel to the river to allow floodwaters to flow harmoniously out to sea. Legends say that Yu worked on the river for 13 years without ever returning home. Once he passed by the gate to his home and heard his wife and children crying out of loneliness, but he continued on his way rather than interrupt his flood control work. Because he tamed the Yellow River, Yu became a popular hero, and Peets praised the men who protected fields and villages from deadly and destructive floods. By exalting Yu as an exemplar of virtue, Chinese moralists promoted the values of social harmony, and selfless, dedicated work that the Sage King represented. Archaeological excavations show that China was a site of Paleolithic communities as early as 400,000 years ago. In South Asia, humans appeared to at least 200,000 years ago, long before the Aryans introduced Indra to South Asia. Yet, as in Mesopotamia and Egypt, population pressures in both East and South Asia induced human groups to begin experimenting with agriculture. By 7000 BCE, agriculture had taken in India's Indus River, and by 3000 BCE, it had spread throughout much of the Indian subcontinent in roughly the same period, between 7000 and 5000 BCE. People in China's Yangtze River Valley domesticated and became dependent on rice, while people farther north in the Yellow River Valley learned to cultivate and depend on millet. I'm so sorry. There we go. Harappan Society. Like societies in Mesopotamia and Egypt, the earliest urban society in South Asia was built by indigenous Indian peoples in the valley of a river, the Indus, whose waters were available for irrigation of crops. The society, called Harappan Society after one of its two chief cities, thrived between 3000 BCE and 19,000 BCE. Scholars believe that as the Harappan Society fell into decline over the next 400 years, Indo-European migrants from the northwest began to settle in South Asia over time. The two groups mixed and became indistinguishable from each other. In the process, they created a unique social and religious order that helped shape South Asian society until modern times. Although scholars know that cities were evolving in the Indus region by 3000 BCE, it is impossible to follow the development of Harappan society in detail. One reason is that many of the earliest Harappan's physical remains lie people in India's Indus River Valley built South Asia's first cities in what has come to be known as Harappan Society. Harappan Society collapsed about 15,000 BCE, and it seems probable that Indo-European Aryan migrations into India increased in intensity at around the same time. Eventually, it seems clear that the Aryan peoples interacted and intermarried with indigenous peoples of India, and that the combination led to the development of a distinctive society and a rich cultural tradition in China. Three dynastic states based in the Yellow River Valley brought much of China under their authority during the second millennium BCE. In the process, they forged many local communities into a larger Chinese society. At the same time, all three dynasties had frequent dealings with neighboring peoples to the west who linked China to other societies and brought knowledge and technologies from afar, as in early Mesopotamia and Egypt. Then complex societies in both South and East Asia promoted the development of distinctive social and cultural traditions in the context of cross-cultural interaction and exchange. Below the existing water table, and thus are inaccessible to archaeologists, another reason is the lack of deciphered written records. Because scholars have so far been able to understand the complex pictograph Harappan script, as a result, our understanding of Harappan society depends entirely in the study of accessible material remains. The Indus River. If the Greek historian Herodotus had known of Harappan society, he might have called it the gift of Indus. Like the Nile, the Indus draws its waters from rain and melting snow and towering mountains. In this case, the Hindu Kush and the Himalayas, as the waters reach the lowlands, the Indus deposits huge quantities of silt on its banks. Although the Indus periodically caused extensive destruction from flooding, it did make agricultural society possible in northern India. Early cultivators sowed their crops along its banks in September after the flood receded, and harvested their crops the following spring. As in Mesopotamia and Egypt, agricultural surpluses in India vastly increased the food supply, stimulated population growth, and supported the establishment of cities and specialized labor. Between 3000 and 25,000 BCE, the agricultural surplus of the Indus Valley fed two large cities, Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, as well as subordinate cities in vast agricultural hinterland. Harappan Society embraced much of modern-day Pakistan and a large part of northern India as well, a territory of about 1.3 million square kilometers, 502,000 square miles, and thus was considerably larger than Mesopotamia or Egyptian society. Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro. No evidence survives concerning the Harappan political system, although archaeological excavations do not suggest a royal or imperial authority. However, both Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro had city walls, a fortified citadel, and a large granary, suggesting that they served as centers of political authority and sites for collection and redistribution of taxes paid in the form of grain. The two cities represented a considerable investment in human labor and other resources. Both featured marketplaces, temples, public buildings, extensive residential districts, and broad streets laid out on carefully planned grid. Two cities clearly established the patterns that shaped the larger society. Weights, measures, architectural styles, and even brick size were consistent throughout the land. This standardization no doubt, reflects the prominence of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro as powerful and wealthy cities, whose influence touched all parts of the Harappan society, as well as the degree to which the Indus River facilitated trade, travel, and communication. Among the far-flung regions of Harappan society, specialized labor and trade, like other complex societies in ancient times, Harappa engaged in trade, both domestic and foreign. Pottery tools and decorative items produced in Harappa, the Mohenjo-Daro found their way to all corners of the Indus Valley, while the cities imported precious metals and stones from neighboring peoples in Persia and Hindu Kush mountains. During the period of about 2300 to 1750 BCE, they also traded with Mesopotamians, most likely via ships that followed the coastline of the Arabian Sea between the mouth of the Indus River and the Persian Gulf. Harappan society and culture. Social distinctions like societies in Mesopotamia and Egypt, Harappan society generated considerable wealth. Excavations of the Mohenjo-Daro show that it's at its high point from about 2500 to 2000 BCE. The city was a thriving economic center with a population of about 40,000. The wealth of the Harappan society, like that in Mesopotamia and Egypt, encouraged the formation of social distinctions. It is clear from Harappan dwellings that rich and poor lived in very different styles. In Mohenjo-Daro, for example, many people lived in one-room tenements in barracks-like structures, but there were also individual houses of 2 and 3 stories with a dozen rooms and an interior courtyard, as well as a few even larger houses. Almost all houses had private rooms for bathing, as well as toilets that drained into the city sewage systems, which themselves were among the most sophisticated in the ancient world. The absence of the deciphered writing, Harappan beliefs and values are very difficult to interpret, even without written texts. However, material remains shed some tantalizing light on Harappan society. Like other early agricultural societies, Harappans venerated gods and goddesses they associated with the creation and procreation. They recognized a mother goddess and a horned fertility god, and they held trees and animals sacred because of their associations with vital forces. In fact, many scholars believe that some Harappan deities survived the collapse of the larger society and later found places in the Hindu pantheon because they have noticed striking similarities between Harappan and Hindu deities, especially those associated with fertility and procreation. Harappan Declined. Sometime after 19,000 BCE, Harappan society entered a period of decline. A primary cause was ecological degradation. In clearing the land for cultivation and firewood, Harappans deforested the Indus Valley in the process. They facilitated soil erosion and desertification. Over a period of half a millennium or more, most of the Indus valleys became a desert. Agriculture is possible there today, only with the aid of artificial irrigation. These climatic and ecological changes reduced agricultural yields, and Harappan society faced subsistence crisis during the centuries after 19,000 BCE. By about 17,000 BCE, the population of the Harappa and the Mohenjo-Daro had abandoned the cities, and by 15,000 BCE, even the smaller Harappan cities had almost entirely collapsed. The Indo-European Migrations in early Vedic India. Some scholars believe that during the second millennium BCE, as Harappan society declined, bands of nomadic herders filtered into the Indian subcontinent from the northwest mountain passes and settled throughout the Indus Valley and beyond. Most prominent were nomadic and pastoral peoples speaking Indo-European languages who called themselves Aryans, noble ones. By 15,000 BCE, or perhaps somewhat earlier, they had begun to file through the passes of the Hindu Kush mountains and establish small herding and agricultural communities throughout northern India. It is important to note that the specific outlines of Aryan history are deeply contested by contemporary scholars. Disagreements are especially strong, being linguists who trace Aryan migration via the traces left through the language. Archaeologists who have found little material evidence of Aryan artifacts, and some Indian classical scholars who have argued that the theory of the Aryan migration was a false narrative concocted by European imperialists to divide the Indian people in spite of these controversies. However, most scholars still believe that Indo-Aryan migrants did filter into India around or before 15,000 BCE, and that they then played a prominent role in shaping Indian society and the centuries afterward. Although there is much scholars don't yet know about the Indo-Aryan migrations, they appear to have taken place over several centuries. By no means did the arrival of the Aryans constitute an invasion or an organized military campaign. It is likely that the Indo-Aryan migrants sometimes clashed with peoples already settled in India, but there is no indication that they conquered or destroyed Harappan society. By the time the Indo-Aryans entered India, internal problems had already brought Harappan society to the point of collapse. During the centuries after 15,000 BCE, indigenous and Indo-Aryan peoples intermarried, interacted, and laid social and cultural foundations that would influence Indian society to the present day. The Aryans and India. The early Aryans. When they entered India, the Aryans depended heavily on pastoral economy. They especially prized their horses and herds of cattle. Horses were quite valuable because of their expense and rarity. Horses do not breed well in India, so it was necessary for Aryans to replenish their stock by importing animals from Central Asia. Like the Indo-European cousins to the north, the Aryans harnessed horses to carts, and they also hitched them to chariots for use in warfare. Meanwhile, cattle became the principal measure of wealth in early Aryan society. The Aryans consumed both dairy products and beef, and they often calculated prices in terms of cattle. The Vedas, the early Aryans, did not use writing, but instead preserved extensive collections of religious and literary works by transmitting them orally from one generation to another. In their sacred language, Sanskrit, the earliest of these orally transmitted works were the Vedas, which were collections of hymns, songs, prayers, and rituals honoring the various gods of the Aryans. There are 4 Vedas, the earliest and most important of which is the Rig Veda, a collection of 1,028 hymns addressed to Aryan gods. Although it was compiled between the 1400 and 900 BCE, the Aryan priests committed to the Rig Veda to writing only in about 600 BCE. While the Vedas represent a priestly perspective on affairs because of their function in transmitting religious knowledge, they also had shed considerable light on early Aryan society in India. Indeed, in view of their importance as historical sources, scholars refer to the Indian history during the millennium between 1500 BCE and 500 BCE as the Vedic Age. The Vedic Age. The Vedas reflect a boisterous society in which the Aryans clashed repeatedly with indigenous peoples, referred to in the text as dasas, meaning enemies or subject peoples, already living in India. The Vedas identify Indra, the Aryan war god and military hero, as one who ravaged citadels, smashed dams, and destroyed forts the way age consumes cloth garments. These characterizations in the Vedas suggest that competition over land and resources fueled intermittent conflict between Aryan and indigenous people. Although scholars have found little archaeological evidence of such clashes, the Aryans also fought ferociously among themselves. They did not have a state or a common government, but rather formed hundreds of chiefdoms organized by herding communities and agricultural villages. Because of their close proximity, this practice encouraged competition for resources and created enormous potential conflict. Aryan migrations in India. During the early centuries of the Vedic Age, Aryan groups settled in the Punjab, the upper Indus River Valley that straddles the modern-day border between northern India and Pakistan. After 1000 BCE, they began to settle in the area between Himalayan foothills and the Ganges River, where they learned to make iron tools and to practice agriculture. Agricultural surpluses encouraged larger populations and more complex social organizations, and by about 750 BCE, Aryans had established the first small cities in the Ganges River Valley. Population growth also encouraged further migration. Thus, by 500 BCE, Aryan groups had migrated as far south as the northern Deccan, a plateau region in the southern cone of the Indian subcontinent, about 1,500 kilometers, which is about 950 miles south of the Punjab. As they settled into permanent communities and began to rely more on agriculture than on herding, The Aryans gradually lost the tribal political organization they had brought into India and instead evolved more formal political institutions. Indeed, between 1000 and 500 BCE, tribal chieftains increasingly developed into regional kingdoms for centuries. These became the most common form of political organization on the subcontinent. Origins of the caste system. Although Aryans did not build large imperial states, they did construct a well-defined social order. In fact, in some ways, their social hierarchy served to maintain the order and stability that states and political structures guaranteed in other societies. The Aryan social structure known today as the caste system rested on sharp hereditary distinctions between the individuals and groups according to their occupations and roles in society. Caste and Varna. Caste developed gradually as the Aryans established settlements throughout India. Initially increased interaction with indigenous peoples probably prompted Aryans to base social distinctions on either Aryan or indigenous ancestry. In part, those distinctions may have arisen from differences in complexion between the Aryans, who referred to themselves as wheat-colored, and the darker-skinned people native to India. Indeed, the Aryan term Varna, which refers to the major social divisions, comes from the Sanskrit word meaning color. However, over time, Aryans and indigenous peoples mixed, mingled, interacted, and intermarried to the point that distinguishing between them was impossible. After about 1000 BCE, the Aryans increasingly recognized four main Varnas: the Brahmins, the priests; the Kshatriyas, warriors and aristocrats; the Vaishyas, cultivators, artisans, and merchants; and the Shudras, landless, peasants, and serfs. Some centuries later, probably about the end of the Vedic Age, they added the category of the Untouchables, people who performed dirty or unpleasant tasks such as butchering animals or handling dead bodies, and who are theoretically became so polluted from their work that their very touch could defile individuals' higher status. Subcastes and Jati. Until about the 6th century BCE, the four Varnas described Vedic society reasonably well, because they did not live in cities and did not yet pursue many specialized occupations. The Aryans had little need for a more complicated social order. Over the longer term, however, a much more elaborate scheme of social classification emerged. As Vedic society became more complex and generated increasingly specialized occupations, the caste system served as the umbrella for a complicated hierarchy of subcastes known as jati, which were hereditary categories largely determined by occupation. By the 18th and 19th century in its most fully articulated form, the system featured several thousand jati, which prescribed individual roles in society in minute detail. Castes and subcastes deeply influenced the lives of individual Indians through much of history. Members of a jati ate with one another and intermarried, and they cared for those who became ill or fell on hard times. Elaborate rules dictated forms of address and specific behavior appropriate for communication between members of different castes and subcastes. Violation of the jati rules could result in expulsion from the larger group. That penalty was serious, since an outcast individual could not function well and sometimes could not even survive when shunned by members of the larger society. Castes and social mobility. The caste system never functioned in an absolutely rigid or inflexible manner, but rather operated so as to accommodate social change. Individuals sometimes prospered on the basis of their own initiative, or else they could fall on hard times and move down in the social hierarchy. More often, however, social mobility came about as members of a jati improved their condition collectively. Achieving upward mobility was not an easy matter. It often entailed moving to a new area or at least taking on a new link of work. But the possibility of improving individual group status helped to dissipate social tensions. In addition, the caste system enabled foreign people to find a place in Indian society by allowing newcomers to organize into well-defined groups that eventually came to adopt caste identities. By the end of the Vedic Age, caste distinctions had become central institutions in Aryan India, whereas in other lands, states, and empires maintained public order. In India, the caste system served as a principal foundation of social stability. Individuals have often identified more closely with their jati than with their cities or states, and castes have played a large role in maintaining social discipline in India. The Law Book of Manu. While building an elaborate social hierarchy on the foundation of the caste and the varna distinctions, the Aryans also connected a strongly patriarchal social order on the basis of gender distinction. At the time of their migrations into India, men had already dominated Aryan society. All priests, warriors, and tribal chiefs were men, and the Aryans recognized descent through the male line. Women influenced affairs within their own families, but enjoyed no public authority. As the Aryans settled in agricultural communities throughout India, they maintained this thoroughly patriarchal society. Only males could inherit property unless the family had no male heirs, and only men could preside over the family rituals that honored departed ancestors. A text from about the 1st century BCE called the Book of Manu illustrates the patriarchal ideologies that helped structure Indian society. Although composed after the Vedic Age, the Law Book of Manu reflected the society constructed early under Aryan influence. The author advised men to treat women with honor and respect, but he insisted that women remain subject to the guidance of the principal men in their lives. The law book also specified that the most important duties of women were to bear children and maintain wholesome homes for their families. Religion in the Vedic Age. As the caste system emerged and helped to organize Indian society, distinctive cultural and religious traditions also took shape. The Aryans entered India with traditions and beliefs that met the needs of mobile and often violent society. As they spread throughout India and mixed with indigenous peoples, however, the Aryans encountered new religious ideas they considered intriguing and persuasive. The resulting fusion of Aryan traditions with indigenous beliefs and values laid the foundation for Hinduism, a faith immensely popular in India and parts of Southeast Asia for more than 2 millennia. Aryan religion. As in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and other lands, religious values in India reflected the larger society. For example, during the early centuries following the Aryan migration, the focus on Indra, the war god, testified the instability and turbulence of early Vedic society. Also important for those early beliefs was the proper performance of ritual sacrifices. Through sacrifices, Aryans hoped to win the favor of the gods to ensure military success, large families, long life, and abundant herds of cattle. But those rewards required constant attention to religious ritual. Proper honor for the gods called for households to have Brahmins perform no fewer than 5 sacrifices per day, a time-consuming and expensive obligation. Spirituality. As the centuries passed, many Aryans became dissatisfied with the sacrificial cults of the Vedas, which increasingly seemed like sterile rituals rather than a genuine means of communicating with the gods. Beginning about 800 BCE, many thoughtful individuals left their villages and retreated to the forest of the Ganges River, where they lived as hermits and reflected on relationships between human beings, the world, and the gods. These mystics drew considerable inspiration from the religious beliefs of the indigenous people, who often worshipped nature spirits that they associated with fertility and the generation of new life. Some scholars also argue that indigenous people may have believed that human souls took on new physical forms after deaths of their bodily hosts. Although evidence is limited, nevertheless, over time, the notion that souls could experience transmigration and reincarnation, that an individual soul could depart one body at death and have become associated with another body through a new birth, intrigued thoughtful people and encouraged them to try and understand the principle that governed the fate of souls. As a result, a remarkable tradition and religious speculation emerged. The blending of Aryan and indigenous values. The tradition achieved at its fullest development in a body of works known as Upanishads, which began to appear late in the Vedic Age, about 800 to 400 BCE. The word Upanishad literally means a sitting in front of, and it refers to the practice of disciples gathering before a sage for a discussion of religious issues. The Upanishads often took the form of dialogues that explored the Vedas and the religious issues that they had raised. Brahman, the universal soul. The Upanishads taught that each person participates in a larger cosmic order and is one with the universal soul known as Brahman. Whereas the physical world is a theater of change, instability, and illusion, Brahman is internal and unchanging, permanent foundation for all things that exist. Hence, the only genuine reality. The authors of the Upanishads believed that individual souls were born into physical world not once but many times. They believed that souls appeared most often as humans, but sometimes as animals, and possibly even occasionally a plant or other vegetable matter. Teachings of the Upanishads. The Upanishads developed several specific doctrines that helped to explain the line of thought. One was the doctrine of samsara, which held that upon death, individual souls go temporarily to the world of the fathers and then return to the earth to a new incarnation. Another was a doctrine of karma, which accounted for the specific incarnations that souls experienced. According to this doctrine, individuals who lived virtuous lives and fulfilled all their duties could expect rebirth into a pure and more honorable existence. For example, into a higher and more distinguishable caste, those who are accumulated a heavy burden of karma, however, would suffer in a future incarnation by being reborn into a difficult existence, or perhaps even in the body of an animal or an insect. The Upanishads also encourage the cultivation of personal integrity, a self-knowledge that would incline individuals naturally toward both ethical behavior and union with Brahman. In addition, they taught respect for all living things, animal as well as human. Animal bodies, after all, might well hold incarnations of unfortunate souls suffering the effects of heavy debt of karma. A vegetation diet thus become a common feature of the aesthetic regime. So sorry. Yet even under the best circumstances, the cycle rebirth involved a certain amount of pain and suffering. The authors of the Upanishads sought to escape the cycle altogether and attain the state of moksha, which they characterize as a deep dreamless sleep that came with permanent liberation from physical incarnation. This goal was difficult to reach since it entailed several ties to the physical world and identifying with the ultimate reality of Brahman, the universal soul. The two principal means to the goal were asceticism and meditation, which could help individuals purge themselves of desire for the comforts of the physical world. Religion and Vedic society. Just as the Aryan focus on Indra reflected early Aryan society, so the religious views of the Upanishads dovetailed with the social order of the late Vedic Age. Indeed, the doctrines of the samsara and karma certainly reinforced the Vedic social order. They explained why individuals were born into their cases, and they encouraged individuals to observe their castle duties and hopes of enjoying a more comfortable and honorable incarnation in the future. However, these doctrines were not simply cynical means of controlling Vedic society. Indeed, the sages who gave voice to these doctrines were conscientiously attempting to deal with meaning of spiritual and intellectual problems. Like Greek philosophers, Christian and theologians, and many others, the authors of the Upanishads sought the ultimate truth and certain knowledge in an ideal world that transcends our own. This is the end of chapter 3, part 1.